Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second session of papers. Before we start, let me say I will be probably the first of many, but let me thank Sarunas again for the great organization and invitation. Each of us in different shapes having our envelopes. So thanks a lot for this. Okay, so I'm very happy to present Laurent Capron, who is a research engineer in Paris. He's a doctor in Greek technology. His research focuses on paleography, transmission of ancient musical papyrus, and he works at the Center Jean Pépin at the CNRS. He's working currently on a couple of important projects. One of them is the digital edition of the Musici Scrittori Greci, the young printed edition, which is going to become digital, and is going to reorganize all the musical documents of Greek antiquity. So please, thanks, Laurent. His paper is titled "Writing the Music: What the Ancients Want Us to Remember."
The inscription on the Seikilos column immediately plunges us into the question of durability, of memory beyond human time. Accompanied by its famous melody, but stripped of what once adorned it above, the phrase now invites us to turn not to the image above, but to the notation below. Since it is this melos that today has become a lasting sign of immortal memory. If we are fortunate enough to have found this melody, the only one to have come down to us intact from antiquity, we are above all fortunate enough to know how to decipher and interpret it. Of course, musical signs have existed to ensure that music endures. But not only have we lost many musical treatises, we have also lost many scores. In a society where music played such an important part in everyday life and events, the scarcity of these witnesses cannot be due to chance alone. Based on the meager traces that remain, we will therefore look at the evolution of what the ancients wrote down, the limits of such a system, and the consequences of a system of notation created for specialists. Aristophanes makes a particularly interesting reference to the understanding of music. He says, comprehension of music comes from two things, perception and memory. For we have to perceive what is coming to be and remember what has come to be. There is no other way of following the content of music. But if you think that Aristophanes is going to propose that the memory of music should be based on the system of notation, you will soon be disappointed. Immediately after this sentence, he sets out, in rather unfriendly terms, his pejorative view of musical notation, which he denies the status of a discipline in the science of harmony. As to the objective that people assign to the science, called harmonics, some say that it lies in the notation of melodies, claiming that this is the limit of the comprehension of each melody, while others locate it in the study of oloi, and the ability to say in what manner and from what origin each of the sounds emitted by the olos arises. But to say these things is a sign of complete misunderstanding. So far from being the limit of harmonic science, notation is not even a part of it, unless writing down meters is also a part of the science of meter. Before, however, judging Aristophanes' opinion of musical notation too hastily, we must here refer to another author, in this case Aristides Quintilianus. Indeed, when Aristophanes excludes musical notation, the parasemantic and techne, from the scope of harmonic science, he explains what kind of notation he's talking about. That what we say is true, and that the practitioner of notation needs nothing more than a perceptual grasp of the magnitudes of intervals will be clear to those who consider the matter. A person who sets out signs to indicate intervals does not use a special sign for each of the distinctions which exist among intervals. We shall say the same thing about the functions which the natures of the tetrachords create. For the interval from nete, hyperbolaia to nete, and that from mese to hypate, are written with the same sign, and the signs do not distinguish the differences in their functions, so that their scope extends only to the magnitudes and no further. We are therefore talking here about a system of notating intervals between notes, not a system for notating degrees, so that we know immediately what function they occupy in the musical scale. So if this system handed down to us by the famous tables of Alypius, nothing is less certain. Aristides Quintilianus speaks of different systems of notation. In particular, he describes a system for notating the intervals between notes. I have set out below the harmonia divided by dieses, which is found in the ancient authors. It makes the first octave through a total of 24 dieses and proceeds in the second by steps of a semitone each. This table poses a large number of problems, which Jacques Chaillet has attempted to resolve in his analysis at the cost of redesigning certain signs and possibly moving them. Whatever one thinks of his demonstration, he has shown that this system is probably the one referred to by Aristoxenus when he tackles the question of music notation. According to Aristoxenus, it is interval notation that is useless, or at least secondary. Nous allons peut-être maintenant comprendre enfin le sens de ce passage devant lequel tous les commentateurs ont déclaré forfait. Le reproche est le même que ci-dessus, on pose les signes des intervalles sans se préoccuper de savoir s'il s'agit du tétrachorde de l'hyperbolée, de la mèse ou de l'hypate. En somme, on pourrait résumer Aristoxène en disant qu'il mentionne, avec fort peu d'intérêt, une notation d'intervalle à laquelle il reproche de rendre compte de façon purement mécanique de la grandeur des intervalles, sans se préoccuper de la valeur analytique des sons qu'il détermine. Il ne nous en dit malheureusement pas plus à ce sujet, mais le peu qu'il nous dit n'est absolument pas applicable à la notation d'Alypius. Whether the system of interval notation was useful or not, today we have no trace of it other than that left to us by Aristides Quintilianus, and it seems with a certain number of errors of copy or interpretation. On the other hand, Aristides Quintilianus is more explicit about the new system of notation, the structure of which he explains. He gives the series of musical signs, the vocal series above and the instrumental series below, according to different diagrams. The first two give the distribution of signs by tone, the second starting a semitone above the first. And the third diagram compiles the first two, giving a scale by semitone. So that's what he says here. I have set out below the diagram of the letters in the sequence of semitones and that in the sequence of tones, together with a tropoi, which can be represented by them. Our diagram sets out the symbols in two series, so that we may grasp the sequence of those in the upper series from their similarity to those in the lower, so that we may represent instrumental pieces and interludes in songs for alloy or for stringed instruments without the voice by the lower series, vocal pieces by the upper. And so that we may readily keep hidden the mysteries of music by replacing the letters in everyday use by the symbols written below in the diagram setting out the tonoid. Of these three reasons, the second makes no difficulty in interpretation. Since it's already well known to everyone, it is a reminder that each note can be written by a vocal sign or an instrumental sign depending on the situation. The first is difficult to explain, but this is not the place to comment on that problem here. As for the third, it leaves us literally perplexed. Why give a diagram that aims to conceal the mysteries of music if precisely this diagram is given? Be that as it may, these new diagrams were used to record elements that were missing from Aristophanes' musical notation. Notations of intervals were succeeded by notations of degrees and dynamics. Has the creation of this new system of musical notation fulfilled Aristophanes' expectations on the need for understanding and memory? The opinions expressed by Aristides Quintilianus on the three objectives of notation now in use are very much a posteriori. What value should be attached to them? The link between vocal and instrumental notations has been the subject of an in-depth study by André Bataille, who has shown that they were established successively and not in a univocal and immediate manner. He has shown that the two systems were eventually brought together into a single system at the cost of several evolutions. En conclusion, deux notations. L'une, la vocale, d'une constitution claire et suivie. L'autre, l'instrumentale, qui paraît bien avoir été réalisée après et d'après l'autre, toutes deux explicables, pour l'essentiel de leur morphologie, par les écritures du IVe siècle avant Jésus-Christ, mais dont certaines influences des graphies cursives nous obligent à abaisser la date jusqu'aux 50 premières années du IIIe siècle. Un effort de systématisation, de mise en parallèle, qui sent l'arrangement, la pensée claire, cartésienne dirais-je presque, des périodes où l'on établit des bilans et qui succèdent à d'autres, d'orages et d'assauts, fécondes mais désordonnés. Une tendance à vouloir scientifiquement tout symboliser, même des additions tardives au fond primitif. Un souci également de conserver le plus possible des richesses du passé, même quand certaines formes d'art avaient cessé provisoirement d'être appréciées. Donc de la mise en ordre, de l'érudition, de l'humanisme. Tout cela nous suggère un nom, celui d'Alexandrie. The third objective is that of someone who is aware of the complexity of a system that is reserved for a certain professional elite. In so doing, this elite, which claims to preserve the secrets of music, becomes the holder of the memory of music. We know that other forms of notation, or at least other states of notation, have existed. Aristides Quintilianus mentions a solfeggio notation that uses syllables beginning with the letter tau, followed by the vowels epsilon, omega, alpha, and eta. These syllables always correspond to the same functions in the tetrachord and make it possible to quickly solfege a tune without having to go through the process of naming characters that are, to say the least, unpronounceable. But papyri have also provided us with a group of fragments that are difficult to interpret. These are DHEAIM 528, mainly a set of 64 papyri fragments preserved in the Ashmolean Museum, What all these fragments have in common is the use of a set of signs. However, this group uses a set of signs that does not correspond to any of the scales listed in the Alypius tables. In fact, to take just one example, the sign nu, which is rarely used in general, is very common here, but within scales where it should not appear. Moreover, the list of signs shows that both diatonic and chromatic signs were used for the same scale. I want to emphasize here that musical notation was established gradually, that what we know best about it is the state in which it was found in late Roman times, that it had to evolve to meet a certain number of expectations on the part of professional musicians. As Christos Tersis pointed out to me 2 years ago at the MOISA Symposium in Cremona, certain signs only seem to appear from the Roman period onwards, in particular, signs that are used to alter the notes, such as the dicolon, the compismos sign, or the lemma. This impression is perhaps skewed by the disproportion between the ancient and more recent witnesses. But we must ask ourselves what the purpose of these signs is. Do they serve to designate new, recently created musical elements, or do they serve to record phenomena that did not need to be recorded before? Perhaps they are there simply to preserve the memory of what had to be known long enough, but which was tending to be lost, such as certain ornamentation, or, on the contrary, to fix them so that freedom of interpretation did not run counter to the proper preservation of the melos. Thus, the decemel is used in places where it is absolutely not necessary, but where it simply indicates that the syllable is long. This is the case, for example, of the Papyrus of Oslo 1430. This practice can only be explained if it is intended for a readership likely to be unfamiliar with the syllable durations in poetry. Durations that are nonetheless obvious to a professional Greek musician. Finally, despite all the developments in the notation, it only transcribes a melos or a colon. No text is preserved on how to accompany sung music, unless certain signs are misunderstood in this sense. And the instrumental scores do not give us any more information on tempo, instruments, percussion accompaniment, and so on. It is no exaggeration to describe this notation as laconic. Despite its evolutions, it doesn't preserve more than the melos. It is therefore clear that musical notation was the exclusive domain of specialists. As we have already seen, the syllabic system of solmization described by Aristides Quintilianus was used for everyday musical learning, and musicians, whether singers or instrumentalists, had to learn pieces of music by heart. But why such a desire to keep control of the notation system and notated scores? Was it to preserve privileges, or to prevent the holders of musical memory from becoming useless by releasing their knowledge? It is worth noting, however, that the number of notated scores is very small compared with the large number of literary papyri preserved, around 35 papyri, out of the more than 7,300 literary papyri currently listed in the Cedopal MP3 database, which does not include the Herculaneum papyri or the Christian papyri. While it is easy to imagine that the scrolls we have preserved on papyrus were intended to enrich the heritage of the powerful technique associations, which must have guaranteed their value, the same cannot be said of scrolls inscribed in marble. These scrolls were intended to be displayed for all to see. As we have seen, very few people knew how to decipher musical notation, and it is hard to imagine that these inscriptions would have served as a lasting repertoire of musical scores. And yet, the engraving of these inscriptions was intended to serve as a memorial. The inscription preserves the melos, like the papyrus, but not with a view to reinterpreting it. It serves only to honor the poet who composed it. It makes the poet and his work sacred. The aim is not to transform the melos into an object of heritage with potential monetary value, but on the contrary to transmit it beyond the human medium and guarantee its memory forever. After outlining the stages in the creation of the system of notation, as transmitted to us in the tables of Alypius, I have tried to sketch the intentions of the music notator and what he sought to preserve of the music through the successive evolutions of notation, first intervallic, then dynamic. But as much as this system was designed to preserve melodies, whether sung or played, we can see a desire not to let knowledge of musical notation escape outside a closed circle in order to preserve the greatest possible heritage value for notated scores. Conversely, it is the inscriptions that seem to go beyond this desire to restrict access to musical notation, but not by making it accessible to everyone through broad education. In reality, it is simply a matter of consecrating a musical work and its poet, and exposing it in its incomprehensibility, like a hieroglyphic inscription. Fortunately, the Rosetta Stone of this musical system has come down to us, at least in a large part, and we can decipher most of the notation, even if the precise meaning of certain signs still eludes us. I would also point out that, thanks to the people who decided to inscribe for the millenaries to come 2 hymns on a stone block because they wanted to honor the winners of musical contests, and thanks to the scribes who for centuries have copied manuscripts containing signs that were meaning nothing to them, 130 years ago precisely, on the 16th of June 1894, a select audience gathered at the Sorbonne to establish the modern Olympic Games heard for the first time the Delphic hymn to Apollo, deciphered by Theodore Renac and harmonized by Gabriel Fauré, who turned this hymn in a lasting sign of immortal memory. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. It was wonderful to. I think you showed us how important it is to reflect not only what has been written on this papyri or stones, but why and the reason behind what happened. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, thank you for this excellent presentation, which contained a few things which I would regard in minority opinion. Nevertheless, you often say there's no doubt of that. Do you really have no doubts that, for instance, the Olympian notation would very well fit the description of Aristoxenus, like Perrot has hold, like Parker has accepted, for instance, or that many of those literate people who learned music in the Roman period or the Hellenistic period would actually also learn how to apply a dozen of characters to their lyre strings, would then make it much easier Arcadians?
Can you repeat the question? Because the speaker goes there. And the sound makes very loud. So just repeat the question.
I think it was
very short.
too long to repeat, right?
Just shortly, the question is, can you repeat just the question?
The question is on the mic is, you stated, for instance, that Aristoteles and the European system don't go together. As a fact, also Böllmann and Barker both say otherwise. You see as a fact that most people wouldn't be able to read musical notation in spite of many people learning to play an instrument, and I think it would be much easier to know 12 or 14 signs to write that down and to be able to read at home what they were taught.
Well, I was asking myself if it was easy to learn the Aleppius tables, and I think if you go to musical school, that's not a problem to learn it. So yes, it's a bit odd to think that people were not able to understand the so-called complexity of the Aleppius tables, which are not that complex at the end. But what Aristotle says precisely is that what you need when you notate the music is to hear the intervals. So it fits exactly with what Quintilianus says about that. And he explained that then we have a new system of notation. So, of course, we don't know when the notation of the archaioi, that's what Aristotle Quintilianus called them, was. But obviously, it's not that old because what he says about Plato's period is already panipalaiotatoi people. So they are much older. That's in the chronology, it's like that. So they are the archaioi and they are the even older ones. So if you put them in the order, it fits with the idea. I mean, I agree with Chaillet, who consider that it could be the same. Of course, I have no proof, but there is also no objection to that. I mean, it works well, I think, and that would explain why we needed what they wanted to make a new system where every note has a function, not only a difference with the previous one, because that's a different system. And we have no score of the old one, so we can compare. That's a problem. I mean, the only notation we know is the Aleppius one.
Most people don't hear pitches, most people hear only intervals.
Yes,
so even for the modern system, you need to hear intervals to transcribe.
But that's what Aristotle says. He said that the notator just needs to be able to recognize the width of the interval.
And that's true for every notation system.
Yes, and but I think that's why it's so complicated to write this notation, because you have to be able to hear that. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know.
We have time for another very quick question. If there are no, can I ask you something?
Yes, of course.
You talked a lot about melodic notation and also about other signs, but what do you think about some specific signs like the oblique strokes or the zeta in the rest of Papyrus, which seems to have a similar meaning but a different shape?
Yes.
So do you think that each, well, not each, several traditions, several ways of signing the same?
I think it has changed in the ages, that it was not always the same sign which was used.
Okay, so you think about the kind of evolution of the same, of the signs and not
Yes,
of different traditions of...
Obviously, the notation is more and more complex. When you go to the latest period, to the later period, you see more signs around every notation.
You see, because this kind of signs are found also in another kind of traditional papyruses. The papyruses which report the mimi, not partitures. You have the text and some signs. It's not a musical notation, but signs, there is a tau, there is a story, which are quite similar to these additional signs of musical papyrus.
In the European papyrus, you have also some signs, and we don't know if they are instrumental signs put there, because it's always a one sign below in a square form.
Yes.
And there is also a diastole, so we have hypotheses about it, but we are not sure of what they mean exactly. It's just a proposition. And nobody can say for sure it means that, because we have no way to know it.
Okay.
It's, at the moment it's impossible, because we have no place where it's written. And what we have the other way is a set of signs that we never find in papyri or inscriptions, so we don't know what to do with them. And even when we have the sign or the name of the sign, we have no clue what it means. Because what is a compismos or a teretismos? We don't know, we just know how to write it. And we have no clue how to play it.
Okay.
So it's, we have still a lot of things which are totally unclear in the notation.
Okay, thanks. I think we have to do that again. I will present now Aldins, so I will give the time to change the presentation. Anna is a PhD candidate in musicology at Yale University. Interested in ancient music, history of music, theory, and computational musicology. Her research examines the connection between ancient and medieval words, and last but not least, she plays the solar. She just told me she learned it while she was at the university, and I was very fascinated by this. Okay, her paper is going to be alto. We are staying on papyruses, interactive lines, performances, possibilities in the Yale musical papyrus.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, the greatest thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference, particularly Professor Sylvain. In my paper, Intersecting Lines, Performance Possibilities in the Yale Musical Papyrus, I will discuss my new reading of this source and several pieces of evidence that it may provide into language musical performance in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. The Yale Beinecke Library Papyrus 4510, commonly referred to as the Yale Musical Papyrus, is a wheat-colored fragment just under 10 centimeters square in size, with 3 of its 4 sides torn. Although no information can be ascertained as to its origin or how it was found, what remains of the papyrus is from the bottom of the page, nearly centered on a column break. As described by William Johnson in his reading of the papyrus in 2000, these columns were not written for commentary, and as Johnson reconstructs, notably wider than standard book format. This is a somewhat unusual scribal practice, although not unusual for musical papyri. The fragment's writing is entirely recto. 2 separate hands are noted, one neat, one possibly professional, using a pen, the other untrained, using what is likely a reed brush. More on the roles of these 2 hands later, but primarily the neater hand was used to notate the song's lyrics, while the messier hand interlinearly notated the music, as is usual. This musical notation was planned, as can be seen by the spacing, and especially the space left for the 9-note melisma in the right-hand column. At least 2 musical compositions are recorded here, separated by the chronos in the right-hand column, both in baritones register. The musical material recorded by the notation is rather extraordinary. The song in the left column includes the lowest vocal notes used in the corpus of ancient Greek language music as we know it, extending the piece's range to just over 2 octaves, likewise the largest known range in the corpus. Nothing in the papyrus signifies that a single singer was intended for this performance, although expecting such a range for multiple vocalists certainly would have required a very specific context. There is also extended rhythmic notation and melismatic passages, clearly indicating the florid style of composition, consistent with Johnson's dating of the scribal hands to the early 2nd century CE. This style, combined with the poetry's likely use of dactylo epitric meter, which had gone out of style for Coleman and West by the 1st century BCE, would indicate that the songs recorded on the papyrus fit into a tradition of composing new melodies to older poetry. In my own transcription of the papyrus, I took a rather conservative approach, opting to refrain from attempting too much interpretation of the torn edges of the papyrus and focusing on the general morphology of each grapheme that is clearly visible. I'd be happy to talk through this in the Q&A. I don't have time to go through all of my specific choices here. but for the sake of time, I'd like to continue forward. Here is my edited text of the song's poetry, which is unusually repetitive in its use of rhymes, consonant, and word choice. You can see here Rusomai, Tusomai, having sort of that triple syllable rhyme, and Pharaoh repeated 2 lines in a row as well. Of note here is that I do not accept Johnson's assumption, which is followed by Pullman and West, that the text at the end of line 4 was struck, and keep the kappa, lambda, and omega as the beginning of a word on the next line. My reasoning for this will be explained later on in the presentation and as part of my discussion of line 4a. Here we have the translation. At least one, if not both, songs are under the logical subject. The text of the first song, which is the left column, includes imagery of nature and worship likely related to the muses, while the second song, which is far more fragmentary, contains words commonly associated with singing in many cultures. Music, of course, weeping, women, and birds. I'll give a second just to read through that if you desire. Overall, the Yale musical Papyrus has several extraordinary features, its melismas, vocal range, and repetitive poetry among them. However, my reading brought new light to 3 of its most unique features. First among them, and most significantly, the additional line of text and musical notation, which was inserted by the music's notator between the 3rd and 4th line of the text, line 4a, as I referred to it earlier. This is not the only moment of a correction or insertion in the papyrus, however, as the second to last line in the left-hand column was torn right before an added pi. Corrections and insertions are also not the only interesting thing about this papyrus, as unusually formed music notation in several places opens the possibilities for different interpretations as to how this music may have been performed. But we'll begin with this inserted line. Containing both text and musical notation, I apologize for the image quality here. It was added in the messier hand of the music's notator rather than by the likely professional scribe who had written the text. It sits directly above the word asko, I will sing, in line 4, and seems to respond with its text, referencing the Castilian muses. Although this is the messiest and most torn section of the papyrus, of note is the last letter of text and the musical note above it, which Pullman and West thought was an arsistot over notation in the right-hand column, remarking that it is, quote, faint and displaced to the left and the eastern ink, unquote. Although difficult to see in digital images, this is without doubt an additional syllable and note in the music, which has previously not been noticed. Likewise, unfortunately difficult to see here, is the last 3 letters of the line below this interjection, that kappa, lambda, and omega, as I referenced earlier. These were said by Johnston, quote, to have been erased in antiquity, and the musical note above it apparently cancelled with a slash. The fact of its erasure implies that more text and music ending in kappa, lambda, omega is added superlinearly, unquote. That is, it is assumed that the added poetry and music above this line were meant to be performed as part of the continuous string of solo song represented by the rest of the notation. However, nothing in the papyrus itself confirms this reading, and the slash referenced by Johnston, and following him, Pullman and West, was not found in my own reading. The supposedly erased syllable klo is not materially distinct from other portions of the papyrus. And in fact, the letter several lines later in the text that likely was corrected is treated entirely differently. Here, a pi, which would neither make sense with the musical context of the vocal melody nor match any known instrumental grapheme, is written above and somewhat over the chi of the text. It is thus reasonable to take this pi as a correction to the text. To that end, Johnson sees, quote, cancellation dots written to either side of the letter as commonly in literary papyri, unquote. However, it's unclear to what the papyrus he's referring. Whether those dots are present or not, however, this approach to correcting from the papyrus is a significant departure from the assumed rubbing away of the syllable of several lines above, and certainly different from any slashing out of notation. As such, it is perhaps best to treat the interjection above as a separate case entirely from the notational fix below, and start by looking to see what information this lower, rather simple fix can provide before returning to the more complicated case above. As was said, this pi is almost certainly a correction to the text, such that the word reads pelagus rather than the less sensible kalagus. I noted during the overview of the papyrus that there were two hands at work, one a professional hand writing out the text, the other a private hand that largely wrote the notation, and importantly, also the interjection above. The different hands and the planning evident in the page's spacing indicate that this papyrus was used and possibly has musical notation written by a musician, making this likely a musical score for a literary musician. During this period in Egypt, professional scribes were not uncommon, and it is a very real possibility that the musician in question paid for the song's poetry to be written out professionally before personally notating the melody. The correction of chi to chi in the text was not made by the text scribe, however. The difference in the hands can be seen not just through the paleography, but through each writer's choice of writing implement. The professional hand used a type of stylus that resulted in consistently thin stroke on the page, with an even and overall lighter distribution of ink. The private hand's marks are much darker and show curvature and variance in stroke width consistent with a reed brush. This can perhaps be best seen in the lunate sigma above the texture progression in the little pop-out that I have here. Such brushes were the traditional tools used in Egyptian society for writing on papyrus. Stylus pens were only introduced later. As such, the primary users of these brushes, particularly at the turn of the 2nd century CE when this papyrus was notated, were largely ethnically Egyptian. Very little is often known about the scribes of our state musical sources, but thanks to this reed brush, not only do we have a literate musician notating our melodies here, but likely one who was ethnically Egyptian, or in general from a community in which the more traditional writing tools and styles would have been passed down. In Egypt at this time, our musician's identity would have possibly also been tied to class. From the Ptolemaic period on, the most powerful classes were largely ethnically Greek, and later possibly Roman as well. But let us return to this sigma that I mentioned as our example of our reed brush. Because comparing the lunate sigmas that our musician wrote may perhaps provide extra information about the performance context of the pieces that he was notating. And in fact, comparing the sigma above the fix and the first sigma notated in the music, there actually is a morphological difference between the two shapes on the page, with the sigma in the first extant line here in green, notably more angular than the one lower on the page. This same angular shape can be seen perhaps more clearly in another instance lower on the papyrus, which Johnston described as oddly formed. Were these two instances of this more angular sigma a notational choice? On the papyrus, there are 15 total sigmas used in the musical notation, and all 13 others are distinctly curved lunate sigmas. A square sigma does have a distinct musical meaning in the ancient Greek notational system, sitting the interval of fifth above its curved counterpart, which would still fit within the Ionian mode of the rest of the piece. However, in our notational system, the squared sigma is an instrumental note, not a vocal one. So what happens in each of these two readings? Well, in the above case, if we take the two notes highlighted as vocal notation, they divide the syllable nar equally. Simple enough. If we take them as instrumental notes, the melodic and metrical implications are unfortunately unclear without the context of the surrounding notes. We do have a fragment after all. In addition, whether these instrumental notes were to be sounded simultaneously with the vocal melody is not known, particularly due to the placement in line with the text. The famed Orestes fragment does, however, have one of its 8 instrumental notations in line with the vocal melody and not the text, so such a placement is not out of question. The second, more angular sigma in music, particularly with the interjection directly above it, has far more surrounding notation, and we can sort of follow the impact of the different possible readings further in this case. Just below the additional line of text and music, inserted above the word asso, is a dicolon, followed by 2 notes and a lemma. The spacing in particular proves difficult to interpret, as to be written above the first syllable of asso, The spacing in particular proves difficult to interpret, as possibly due to a lack of space, the 2 notes grouped by the dicolon, highlighted here, seem to be written above the first syllable of asso, with the lemma partially over the second syllable. Another note does follow the lemma, but is written further to the right of what should be the corresponding syllable than is customary for this hand. Overall, this is of little concern if the notes in question are all vocal notes, and if the rest of the notation in the line fits within the expected syllables. A notator can certainly run out of space, particularly when several melismas are involved. However, issues arise earlier in the line if a vocal lunate sigma, which is more consistent paleography, is read instead of a questionable dicolon over son, which is offered by Johnston and Holman West. Then 3 notes, the lunate sigma, chi, and alpha, are seemingly assigned to son without a dicolon or hyphen to group them. This problem is in fact a solution, as it allows the angular sigma over asso to be read as the instrumental square sigma. With son sung on the vocal lunate sigma earlier in the line, the 2 remaining vocal notes, chi and alpha, correspond to the 2 syllables of asso. The difficulty of the lemma spacing is also resolved, as it would modify the instrumental notes rather than the vocal melody. Despite the added context, however, just as before, it's unclear from this line alone whether any instrumental notes would sound simultaneously with, or as an interruption to, the vocal melody. As Martin West notes in the context of the Orestes fragment, quote, "It is usually assumed that the instrumental notes were meant to sound between the words, but that would disrupt the rhythm intolerably, and there is no doubt that they were intended to sound simultaneously with the following word, possibly continuing as a drone throughout the phrase. There was nowhere else for the copyist to fit them conveniently but before the word at which they sounded," unquote. With West's analysis in mind, what then happens if we also consider our interjection? Because an interruption may in fact be exactly what's going on with this added notation. Instead of a correction, what if the inserted line was an interruption to the main song, its text of the Castalian ones, that is the muses, responding to the asso, "I will sing," that precedes the lemma. Then West conjectured that the instrumental notes in Orestes served as a drone throughout the phrase, in fact has notational support in the Yale Papyrus. This very lemma implies that either a pause or the previous notes, joined by the dicolon, are held for a triseme in length, triple what they otherwise would have been held for. What then, in this interpretation, becomes a possibility is an instrumental line, or per West, drone, played underneath the interrupting phrase in the melody. Whether that interruption was sort of missed by the text scribe and had to be added in later, whether it was an ad-lib by the performer and thus not included in the original copying of the text, or whether it served as another musical element, such as a corresponding response by another group performer to the soloist's call of asso, is unknown. What is known is that the many possibilities open to ancient performances and the many identities that went into such performances become clear when we examine our evidence with a mind to how all of its different elements intersect. Only by combining our interpretations to each of these 3 parts of our papyrus can we begin to imagine the musica behind all of the intersecting lines. Thank you.
Very precise on time. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
I would like to know if you are aware that this papyrus has been reedited twice already.
Sorry, it's very hard to hear. Can you
Oh,
speak
sorry.
up?
So can I hear?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
that's better.
I don't know if you are aware that by the university that we have reedited the last years with papyrus. I cannot see that you have your bibliography and you see our names. Are you aware of what we have already written or not at all?
I'm sorry, I haven't actually seen that yet, no.
No, because I think on some sites, we can talk about that later because it won't be practical here, but maybe on some sites we have to discuss again your lectures because I think there are still some problems in some readings in the papyrus, and maybe we can talk about that after the coffee break or whatever, because it's quite, maybe it will change your readings, I don't know.
Yes, thank you, that would be lovely.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I find it fascinating the idea of using these material things to think about the people who created them, right? And the people who wrote on the page, and the people who interacted with these. I don't actually know, that's interesting. I was wondering if you had a little bit more that you wanted to say about that, because I find that aspect of it fascinating. Yeah, sorry, that's not really a question, but something that I found really interesting as an application of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times what you'll see in these papyri is, right, this sort of mix of hands that's certainly not uncommon. This sort of addition of the sort of, you can actually see here with the musica here, sorry, there we go, sort of the varying thickness of the brush and things like that, and that kind of like a calligraphic pen or something like that now is really a clear indication of that sort of instrument being used, and really the sort of stylus was primarily used by this point and was sort of imported to the Egyptian region where we think this is from. Unfortunately, the actual provenance of this papyrus is completely unknown. It was bought from dealers in Cairo in the 30s, so goodness only knows. But this sort of, what we can only assume is an Egyptian origin, and this dating would indicate that, yes, not only is this sort of somebody who's not ethnically Greek, or at least not from a Greek community with those sorts of traditions, but sort of this broader impact of sort of culture and this sort of mixing of cultures that we often talk about in the ancient world but don't have concrete evidence of. I found that really exciting about when I was sort of going through the papyrus and looking at it and looking at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for an incredibly interesting talk. I had a very potentially silly question, but I noticed that the little doodle in between the two columns, you transcribed that, and then also I think you had it on your cover slide, and I just thought it was really pretty, and I was just wondering if that, like, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just curious about its presence.
Yeah, so that's a Coronis. It essentially marks the difference between the two songs. So what we can assume is the ending of the first song ends with that very, very, very long melisma on the Sylvain. There's more to the right of it that got torn off, but that's certainly the end of one of the songs. That Coronis and the extra space provided would mark the sort of separation of the two. And then after that, the next song starts, and it starts with the word musica, which I thought was really wonderful. But yeah, so that Coronis, it just sort of marks that it's a separate page, and several people, including Sylvain, who's sitting right here, have noted that this sort of combination of multiple songs would potentially make this sort of a compilation of different songs originally, right? It would sort of be a larger compilation page as opposed to a single composed work.
Actually, the second question that I had.
Thank you. Okay, yes.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely magnificent and so interesting. You and I started speaking briefly about the very long melisma that you've mentioned a couple of times. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that and what you've noticed and anything interesting about that spectacular melisma?
Sure, it's 9 notes, which Rebecca Sears has recently found one that's slightly longer, so I can't say any more than it's the longest melisma that we know. But it's 9 notes. It has 1, 2, 3 hyphens and 1 semicolon separating its notes, which is, this papyrus is actually really exciting because it contains a triseam, a diseam, so many arts and stops. It's really rich with notational sort of rhythmizations. But yeah, this 9-note melisma is something rather fantastic. I wish I could sing it. Yeah, some people have sort of posited that it could be sort of that ending flourishing note, especially at the sort of last line of the first piece. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I think we can move to the other paper. I'd like here Sylvain Brandwood. Sylvain Brandwood is the Classical Library Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, Department of Classics. His research is focused on the revival of religious festivals in the linguistic Athens and in Greek poetry and poetry, with a focus on performance culture. He is going to publish a monograph titled, art songs and festival revival in the Hellenistic Athens. And today is going to talk about the Delphic hymns and the Poetics of festival revival. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Can you please try to say something because we have some problems with the sound?
Well, I'll use this opportunity to thank Professor Sylvain and the rest of the organizing committee. It's great to be here, and thank you all very much. So I'll begin. Within a year of their rediscovery of the Delphic Paians, the piece's first editors, Yale and Eleonora, collaborated with several composers to arrange the hymns for modern orchestration. The debut performance took place in March 1894 for no less an audience than the Greek royal family, followed by an even grander occasion later that year, staged at the Sorbonne in Paris as part of Baron de Coubertin's first Olympic Congress that would establish the first modern Olympic Games, and I thank Dr. Capron for bringing this up just a moment ago. For this event, Reinach collaborated with famous composer Gabriel Fauré to score part of Athenaeus' Paian for voice, harp, flute, and two clarinets in B-flat, coincidentally, as Dr. Capron noted, on this very date in 1894. Fauré may not have been aware of the hymn's performance context at Delphi. Initial publication for his sheet music for piano attributes the composition to a 3rd century BCE poet. But the performance of this Paian as part of the Olympic Congress underscored not only the hymn's celebrated musical character, but also reflected their engagement with festival revival. Athenaeus' Paian ornamented and stimulated the modern revival of the Olympic Games, but the Delphic hymns enjoyed their debut performance as part of another festival revival, the Athenian Pythais at Delphi, celebrated in 128-7 BCE. For Fauré's audience at the Olympic Congress, the performance of what could claim to be authentic ancient music offered immediate sensory connection with a piece of ancient culture, while simultaneously attesting to the discontinuity inherent in the performance of music rediscovered only after 2 millennia of silence. In this paper, I want to consider the nature of the revived performance context for the hymn's first performance at the Pythais, which I contend has important consequences for performance, interpretation, and monumentalization. The revived Pythais offered a calculated opportunity for Athens to leverage some of the city's most valuable assets, its cultural prestige and its historical and legendary pasts, in ways that both situated the city within Roman Imperium, yet also differentiated it from its local peers. The documents from this event preserved on the Athenian treasury, including the hymns, accordingly present the city to the gods, to the Greek world at large, to the Romans, and to the Athenian demos itself, in confident and triumphant terms that argue for its cultural and even civic and military leadership of the changing Greek world. The Delphic hymn status as pieces of revived choral performance provides a valuable example of music and musicians employed in the service of cultural memory, with the real world goal establishing by means of that music Athens' cultural supremacy. The Pythais at which the hymns were performed had been an Athenian theoria involving a grand procession from Athens to Delphi, celebrated in the Archaic and Classical periods, and last attested soon before the death of Lycurgus in 324. In the Classical period, this festival was sent irregularly, only when lightning was observed on special days during spring over the Harma on Mount Parnes. And in the 2nd century, Pythaides were sent in 138-7 and 128-7, and were then later organized into a more regular Eneateris in 106-5 and 98-7, with funds initially raised for the Pythais of 90-89, canceled due to the Mithridatic Wars. This festival formed part of a larger festival program in 2nd century Athens that saw revivals of festivals celebrated in the Archaic and Classical periods that had fallen into neglect during the city's long period of declining political power and absorption into Macedonian and later Roman spheres of influence. As John Michelson notes, we must rely on probability to characterize many of these as revivals, though good evidence can be marshaled to support the identification of a revived Pythais, Delia, Thargelia, and Theseia, among several others. Whether we understand these celebrations as revivals or not, Athenian festival culture increasingly looked to the city's past as a way forward in the late Hellenistic period, and this is true for the Pythais too. To take one example, an Ephebic inscription from 122-1, this is IG 2 squared 1006 if you're interested, describes the involvement of the core of Ephebes in the city's religious life. In addition to participating in 4 possibly revived festivals, last mentioned in 4th century sources, Unichia, Proerosio, Galaxia, and a nocturnal escort of the statue of Pallas to Phaleron, the Ephebes performed numerous festivals in commemoration of signal events in Athenian military history. Festival for Artemis Argyrotura on the anniversary of Marathon, Diogeneia to celebrate the end of Macedonian occupation, the Epitaphia for the war dead, day trips under arms to the borders of Attica, the trophy on Salamis, the Grave Mountain Marathon, and the Amphiorrheion at Oropos, even specifying on stone that this is in fact outside of Athenian territory. In addition to military presentations in armor at the Theseia, Ianteia, and a possibly new festival at the Nike. In addition to this display of historically educated Ephebic martial prowess, however, they had to study at the Lyceum, Academy, and Ptolemaion, observe in meetings of the Assembly and Council, and meet with specifically Roman dignitaries present in the city. Within the boundaries of Attica, the 2nd century city of Athens presented itself as a vibrant cultural and civic force, animated by its military, philosophical, and democratic traditions that could serve as a mediator for their Roman allies with the Greek world at large. The Pythais allows us to see this in an international setting. Ian Rutherford has described the Pythais as the traveling image of the Athenian state. I want to begin examination of this image in regard to the Pythais of 128.7, of which the hymns form a part, by looking at 2 non-musical documents, a list of archons and a list of ephors. The first revived Pythais in 138.7 was in many ways a billboard for the city's ephebes and traditional religious leadership who conducted the Theoria. Gene, like the Eupatridae and Pyrrhachidae, led the procession and provided Theoroi along with the Marathonian Tetrapolis, which had maintained theoric links with Delphi through the 3rd century and had a local Pythion in the deme of Enoi. These groups were also involved in 128.7, but with an increased focus on Athens' civic, military, and cultural importance. For instance, rather than the Gene, it is the College of 9 Archons who lead the Pythais, and this is an item A. Importantly, this is the only example of the Archons appearing collectively outside of Attica, and the 9 Archons as a group only appear together infrequently in inscribed documents in Attica itself. 4 such documents survive, 1 dating from the Severan period. The Archons had declined in practical importance during this period, when the hoplite general and herald of the Areopagus were more important magistracies, but nonetheless we see the administration of the Pythais organized in terms of its traditional democratic leadership. Likewise, Athenian ephebes played a significantly increased role in the Pythais of 128.7, not only conducting the procession, but participating in agones that were added to the festival and demonstrated the ephebes' military skill on horseback especially. 62 Athenian hippes also took part. Unlike other ephebic agones, such as the Theseia, there are no chariot events mentioned, and the only chariot involved was employed to perform the tripodophoria that constituted an important element of the processional ritual linking Athens and Delphi. The list of ephebes for 138.7 does not come with a prescript, but the introduction of the ephebes for 128.7 is likewise unique, and this is an item B. In addition to dating by eponymous archon and priest of Apollo, we have strategoi epitahopla, epitonautikon, epitohippikon, 4 phylarchs, strategoi epiton peraia, epieleusina, along with a host of combat trainers. Traditional cosmetes and pitotribes are joined by a heavy arms trainer, a heavy arms sub-trainer, an archery trainer, javelin trainer, light arms trainer, perhaps suggesting some type of demonstration of military skill during the festival. No such catalog of Athenian military personnel exists otherwise, even in subscription lists for the later Pythais that include several of these, and the Athenians chose to present it in order to frame their forceful expression of local power and tradition at Delphi in 128.7. Unlike future Pythaides, all the ephebes are Athenians, and they are joined by a small group of Delphians and their trainers, though these do not appear to compete in the agones. Slave revolts at Laurion and elsewhere in Attica occurred during the period. The Athenians sent 4 triremes to Carthage in the 3rd Punic War, and may, if Pausanias is to be trusted, erected traditional casualty lists for the fallen. Athenian military adventurism in Oropos did set off the chain of events that led to the destruction of Corinth a decade or so earlier. They clearly did not consider their days of at least local military dominance at an end, as their support for Mithridates in the following generation demonstrates. The third pole of Athenian identity on display in the Pythais of 128.7 is cultural, and it is here that the performance and monumentalization of the hymns enter the frame in support of the Athenians' revivalist program. Pythaiste Paides had sung a paian to Apollo in 138.7, but the second celebration is more notable for the involvement of the Athenian technitai of Dionysus, who had not participated a decade earlier. In addition to being an agonistic festival that showcased Athens' young male military abilities, an especially appropriate frame for paian singing, the Pythais of Dionysios was a musical and poetic spectacular, with performances of comedy, tragedy, and epic, along with performances by aulites, aulos, kitharists, and kitharones. The centerpiece of this festival, I suggest, was the performance of the Delphic hymns attributed to Hymenaeus and Athenae, inscribed on the south wall of the Athenian treasury. The Athenian Technitai, at that time locked in a dispute with the Isthmian Nemean Synodos, as they were, greatly impressed Delphi's Amphictyonic officials, and an honorific confirming their privileges was added to the Athenian treasury after 117-6, although set up on a monument, and also set up on a monument in the precinct of Dionysus at Athens. This is in item C. This document, likely drafted by the Technitai themselves, names the Athenian demos as the metropolis of all drama, in addition to being the founder of civilization through his magnanimous discovery of the mysteries and the harvest that, quote, led humanity from bestial existence to mildness. In the eyes of the Amphictyony, at least, the Technitai at the Pythais and elsewhere had helped to establish Athens as the cultural leader in the Greek world, to complement and adorn their civic and military leadership. The Pythais inscriptions are among the first that were carved on the south wall of the Athenian treasury, and their groupings on the blocks can add to the image of the city that I'd argue the 2nd century Pythais aimed to depict. As has been noted elsewhere, pride of place as you walk up the sacred way was given to the Delphic hymns. A worshipper could see Pindar's metaphorical treasure house of song from Pythian 6 monumentalized. In the context of the Technitai's confident display of musical skill and their participation in the Pythais' presentation of Athenian patriotic glory, the famed musical notation, which virtuosically demonstrated both vocal and instrumental prowess, advertised Athenian musical expertise to a Panhellenic audience, an otherwise unparalleled agalma to the god, and a document of Athenian cultural dominance that pairs well with their civic and military confidence. Furthermore, the hymns and their notation are inscribed directly onto the treasury walls, rather than onto a freestanding stele, a seemingly minor element of inscriptional strategy that sets them apart nearly as much as their musical notation. These are almost the only such examples among surviving inscribed hymns, and are also the earliest. Inscription directly onto the building and inclusion of musical notation engage in a rhetoric of permanence of Athenian performance and song culture that is almost ironic in a revived context such as the Pythais, but nonetheless declares the supremacy of Athenian culture and of the Technitai more specifically. Inscriptional strategies can continue to help us understand the hymn's employment in the praise of Apollo in the city. On the treasury wall, the hymns were bounded on either side by the archon list and the list of effluves. In the festival itself and in its commemoration, the Pythais presented post-imperial Athens in terms of its civic, military, and cultural legacy and prestige. And I've given you the rough schematic from Free the Dove in item D. These 4 documents stood together above the treasury's monumental dedicatory inscription commemorating the Battle of Marathon, the war spoils and statues of the 12 eponymous tribal heroes that surmounted it, and below the depictions of Theseus and Heracles' victory over the Amazons, and other reflection of Marathon, on the treasury metopes and acroteria. The resulting image of the city of Athens reinvesting vigorously in its historical and cultural traditions in service of its interaction with the changing power structures of the late Hellenistic world make the Pythais a valuable example of local and international self-presentation and perception. I've been discussing what we might term the hymn's inscriptional performance and its relation to Athens' program of festival revival, but I would like to pivot now to consider how the revived setting may have changed or enhanced the initial performance of the hymns. Traditional songs formed part of the musical offerings of the Pythais. Inscriptions mention a megas choros that sang a paean to Apollo, numerous akroamata that enhanced the days of the god, and traditional patrios paean was performed in the final Pythais of 98-7. The Delphic hymns, by contrast, as has been discussed by Bowman, Baylis, and others, were innovative and virtuosic performance pieces that required professional musicians, thanks perhaps to the use of chromatic melismata and Praetic Paeonic meter, otherwise unfamiliar from other surviving choral song. In meter, notation, and form, the hymns frame themselves as novel offerings for the god, yet their narration of festival history and the role of the Athenians and the Athenian Technitai in particular emphasizes the Athenian self-presentation involved in the foregoing discussion of the Pythais 128-7. We don't have space to consider all the features of these compositions, but it is enough to say that Lemenios and Athenaeus offer praise for Apollo, Athens, and the Technitai in ways that locate the hymns in performance at the Pythais. The poets each make reference to Apollo's tripod, a standard topos of Delphic imagery to be sure, but also the focus of the festival's tripodophoria, and they both describe specifically Athenian worshiping communities. Athenaeus includes an embedded hymn of the Technitai that describes their festival performance, presumably at the Pythais itself. It is item E. Lemenios describes the birth of Apollo on Delos under an olive tree, a deft substitution that implicates the symbol of Attica par excellence, before narrating the god's journey to Delphi through Attica, where he is praised by the autochthonous Athenians with the original paion that is itself born of the earth, Petrokatoiketos, a striking neologism that could have further resonances with the hymn's musical inscription on stone in item F. This establishes Athens' primacy in aquiline worship and music. Victory over the Python is mentioned briefly in both hymns, but it is not itself the focus of the narratio, for reasons that I suggest may have to do with the revived performance context. Rather than focusing on festival Aition, both Leumenios and Athenaios use the Pythoctonia as a doublet for much more recent historical events, namely Apollo's victory over the Gauls in 279-8. Neither account is especially descriptive, but focuses on the Gauls' status as barbarians and the miraculous weather that Apollo sent to defeat them. I'm giving you this in G and H. Athenaios and Leumenios have largely focused their outline praise to reflect the glory of the Technitai and Athens respectively, but their engagement with the Gallic invasion is crucial to the hymn's revived performance settings. Barbara Kowalczyk has written penetratingly about the importance of festival Aition and the universalizing nature of mythical ideologies for the creation of ritual communities firmly bound to their past through choral poetry. The festival Aition, in this case, perhaps the killing of the Python, is of prime importance to produce this effect, and she argues that, quote, rituals, just as ideological myth, have something of an extratemporal and universal character that can connect past and present and so achieve a transcendence of time that engages with history by abolishing it in the act of performance. A revived choral performance, however, forms part of a festival context especially characterized by historical discontinuity. By its nature, then, such a performance is inserted into the diachronic span of its festival's existence and cannot avoid but engage with such history. The original paion that the Athenians sing in Leumenios' paion achieves Kowalczyk's, quote, transcendence of time in the performance of Cold Song, but the appearance of the Gauls arrests this fusion of mythical past and ritual present by reinserting both the sanctuaries and the festival's history into the hymn's performance. The Gauls force attention away from the autochthonous Athenians, performing their original paion for Apollo, and focuses on the present festival's related revived character. The invasion of 2798 occurred during the period when Athens was occasionally not even able to send a theoria to the Panhellenic Pythia, much less celebrate the Pythais. Apollo achieved his victory over the Gauls without Athenian involvement. The Athenian chorus at the Pythais of 128-7 were able to enact the mythological connection with Apollo that the god's journey through Attica to Delphi provides, but also to gesture to the discontinuity of their own performance culture. The Athens that presented itself at the Pythais was one that acknowledged its post-imperial status, but vigorously bid for the cultural leadership of the Greek world, now controlled by the Roman Empire, for which Leumenios' chorus praised at the conclusion of this fight. The reference to the Gallic sack of 2798 may have been included in the hymns to do honor to the Delphic temple hierarchy, but Apollo's victory was also a signal event in the history of the Athenian Technitai, and so complements the image of Athenian cultural dominance that I suggested characterizes the festival. It is in the aftermath of this victory and the creation of the Amphictyonic soteria that the Technitai first took shape and received their privileges, a fact likewise inscribed on the Athenian treasury. Especially in the context of the dispute between the Athenian and Isthmian Nemean branches, the reference that these paions make to the origin of the relationship between the Athenian Synodos and the sanctuary of Pythian Apollo serves to underline the hymn's goal of honoring the Technitai in Panhellenic context. The Gallic sack appears in both Delphic hymns as a way to weave the history of the Athenian Technitai seamlessly into the history of the Delphic sanctuary, where they enjoyed special privileges after their glorious performance at this Pythais of 128-7, as noted in that Amphictyonic decree in item C. The Gallic sack was a topos that also allowed the Athenian composers of the two paions to incorporate their Roman masters into the Greek world, of which Delphi was the omphalos. The Gauls are described by Leumenios as barbaros ares, the barbarian army, which may also have appeared in Athenaios' similar description of os de Galatan ares barbaros, though the operative word barbaros is in that case entirely contained in the supplement. The Gauls are barbarians and are paralleled with Apollo's other great opponent, the Python, and their defeat represents a victory for all Greeks. The Romans too, however, had recently defeated Greek armies and had entirely destroyed the city of Corinth less than 20 years before the performance of these hymns. And this destruction came at the culmination of over 50 years of progressive military domination. Leumenios, nonetheless, invites the Romans into the circle of Apollo's celibates. They are not Greeks, but they are classed with them as opposed to the barbarian Gauls, and the paion concludes with a prayer to Apollo for their continued success in item The Romans' military superiority over Greece is central to their description here through the hapax doristeton, spear crown, but they nonetheless enjoy the favor of Apollo in his Pythian shrine. Memenios' Athenian chorus acknowledges Roman power, but expresses Athens' cultural power as represented by the Pythais to incorporate the non-Greek Romans into the Greek-worshipping community of the Pythian Apollo, as opposed to the Gallic barbarians. To their own misfortune, the Technitai and their fellow Athenians seem to have believed the triumphant patriotic rhetoric on display at the Pythais. As Posidonius informs us, the Technitai were specially involved in welcoming Aristion, the agent of Mithridates, to the city in 88 BCE, writing, quote, "The Dionysiac Technitai came to meet him, hailing him as the messenger of the new Dionysus, and inviting him to the common hearth and the prayers and libations that occurred there." The Pythais of 128-7 BCE expressed the same type of aims. Limited regional power, accompanied by global cultural dominance, only sought from a different, ultimately more successful benefactor. After Sulla sacked the city in 86 in punishment for Athens' defection to Mithridates, he recovered from an attack of gout or dropsy at the hot springs of Vytautas on the island of Euboea, where Plutarch notes he was entertained by a group of Technitai. These were unlikely to have been members of the Athenian Synodos. They briefly recovered after the sack, enough to repair a temenos belonging to them at Eleusis, before vanishing from the historical record in the 1st century. Their activity at the Pythais of 128-7 can help shed light on the politics and performance involved in a festival revival and the employment of music and musicians in the production and maintenance of cultural memory. Thank you.
I think you showed how important is the context. If we knew the context also for our musical document, we would have a much better interpretation of the overall interpretation of the document.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I'm wondering how the understanding of sort of all of this background around the re-performance of the ancient hymns, like in the ancient world, and all of the processions, all of the festivals. How does that affect how you then look at re-performances in the modern world and at re-festivals? We talked a little bit about it, but I'm curious to hear if you have more thoughts. Now that I've heard sort of the more detailed background, which is fascinating.
Yeah, as far as my interests are essentially in the performance context, and it is definitely the case that we are not reviving the entirety of one of these festivals when we see a terrific performance by a soloist or a choral group of something like one of these peons, which we were talking about, as you mentioned just a moment ago. The fact of their choral nature is, I think, determinative for their value within the context that I described. So when they are re-performed with solo musicians, I think that the difference is highlighted in a certain way. But these differences can be of many different kinds. But some of you may have seen in the closing ceremonies of the Paris Olympics just last summer, one of these poems was performed by a pianist and a solo singer. And the pianist, this was, I'm forgetting their names, the last names are Roche and Bernheim. The pianist was decorated in a costume entirely composed of cassette tape, so kind of an interesting and very strange looking sort of ornament that is nonetheless a recording technology, similar to the recording technology of inscription of the musical notation on stone. Obviously with, I think, different goals, but I thought that was a really fascinating, perhaps, connection between the ancient and then this modern Greek performance. If you haven't seen this, it's on YouTube. It's really terrific. They're both suspended in midair, so the kind of the suggestion of sort of the suspension in time that perhaps a revived festival may be attempting to achieve, or unsuccessfully attempting to achieve, is perhaps on display as well. So we have a number of different ways you can take the focus on revival, even outside of the choral context. But I think that the focus on chorality is what particularly interests me.
Any other questions? Comments? We are terribly on time. I'm scared. I see some people connected, but I don't know if they want to. Okay. So thank you again, and let's call now the last speaker of the session, Sylvain Perrot. Sylvain is an archaeologist, anthropologist, classical scholar, and musician, maybe a collaborator, of course, and an important member of the MOISA group. He's a research fellow at the CNRS in Strasbourg, director of the Unité Mixte de Recherche ArcHiMèdE. He teaches modern Greek civilization at the University of Strasbourg and is very active in many topics connected to ancient Greek music. Today is going to talk about the musical traditions and cultural identity of Arcadians between belonging and detachment. Thanks.
Try to improve my Lithuanian. I think it's okay online. You see the slides? Is there anyone online? Thank you, Eleonora, for the kind words. Of course, I would like to thank very deeply Sharunas Chavelas for the organization and for giving us the opportunity to, at least for me, to discover this wonderful city of Vilnius, and more generally the Baltic countries. To address the question of identity and memory at a regional level in the Greek world, Arcadia seems at first glance to be a particularly interesting case study. Insofar as the history of this regional entity, delimited mainly by mountains due to its central location in the Peloponnesus, is entirely marked by a tension between the claimed autonomy of the cities and the choice of federalism generally imposed by geopolitical circumstances. In the classical period, several attempts to constitute a federation, a koinon in Greek, were relatively ephemeral. Whenever one of the main cities constituting this koinon claims its independence. I just here underline the main cities I'm talking about in this paper. From the north, I'm sorry, I could only find a map in Spanish, so that's the names, the Greek names in Spanish. So Cunaite, Pheneos, Cleitor, and more in the south, Mantinea, Gortina, Megalopolis, which is the newborn capital of Arcadia, Tegea, and Figalia. So, and keep in mind that Megalopolis was actually founded quite later, in contrast to the other cities, because it was founded in 371-68 BC. In the Hellenistic period, after some new upheavals due to the Macedonian expansion, the Arcadians ended up joining the Achaean League, where they played a leading role, notably in the person of the strategos Philopoemen. To the concepts of city and federation, we must add here that of ethnos. The existence of an Arcadian ethnic identity in the archaic and classical periods has been demonstrated by Thomas Nielsen, who used the criteria established by the English sociologist H. Smith. Common name, Arcadian. Common origin myth, the myth of Arcas, the bear. Common history, specific common culture, specific territory, and sense of solidarity. For music, we could add founding myths located in the Arcadian mountains, the birth of the god Hermes, and therefore of the lyre, although the place varies according to the versions. So here's one we bought by Pausanias, joining Silene, so the most famous version of the birthplace of Hermes, is another mountain, Keludoria, so the gift of the light of the tortoise, and it is there. It is said that Hermes found a tortoise, took off the animal skin, and made a lyre from it. And of course, the myth related to the god Pan, inventor of the sirens. At least 2 instruments are therefore said to have seen the light of day in Arcadia. As I presented 2 years ago in Cremona, in the 2nd century AD, Pausanias reports that certain Arcadian woods are reputed to feed turtles, from which lyres are made. Mount Parthenius prehistoric histories that are particularly suitable for the making of lyres. The people who live around this mount, however, are always afraid to take them and will not allow strangers to do so either, because they think they are sacred to Pan. After having passed the summit of the mountain, there is in a cultivated area the boundary between the country of the Tegades and that of the Argives near Cusier in Argos. So, this here the Mount Parthenius, exactly between Arcadia and Tegea here and Argos here. Here I would like to extend the study by taking into account all the available sources on music in Arcadia through the prism of the question that concerns us in this conference between memory and identity. To which I would add the heuristic pair belonging and detachment. How did the varied Arcadian cities caught in tension between autonomy and federalism build their common past and their identity in terms of music? I will first work on the question of memory to see the different modalities of commemoration that we find in Arcadia attached to music. Then I will raise the question of identity, and more precisely the impact that attempts at federalism had on musical practices, and the message thus addressed to other Greek cities in the context of Pan-Hellenic festivals. Finally, by combining the approach through memory and identity, I will consider more precisely the musical repertoires transmitted and performed, in particular the case of new music, and how these pieces can have political or diplomatic function. First, commemorating Arcadian musicians. The Arcadians prided themselves on being one of the oldest people of Greece, displaying their autochthony through a founding myth in which they all recognized themselves, that of Arcas, from whatever city they might have been. What place do music and musicians occupy, and what are the main modalities of transmission of a musical memory? The first modality is actually individual. It consists of a personal approach, the offering of a sound instrument to a divinity. Arcadia thus has a few cases of offerings whose status is, however, different. They are concentrated at the beginning of the 5th century BC and mainly concern Demeter and Kore, whom we know at the Eleusinian Diad, but this would be adopting an Athenocentric view. Arcadia is a place strongly linked with the myth of Demeter, who was said to have another daughter, Despoina. But actually, the only inscribed instrument we have preserved from Arcadia is this symbol with the name of Kore. But there are many debates how to read it, actually. You have here the 3 possibilities. So the first is Kamo kun etuse ta kora. Kamo sacrificed a pig to Kore, because, as you know, pigs were sacrificed to Demeter and Kore. Second, Kamun etuse ta kora. Kamun sacrificed to Kore. Or, according to the specialist of the Arcadian dialect, Kamo un etuse for an etuse ta kora. Kamo sacrificed to Kore. We have only a few other instruments dedicated to deities, actually 2 other symbols, but much lighter, which would have been unearthed in the Vytautas Gortinias, which is also a sanctuary dedicated to Demeter. And I know that because I recently made an overview of all the musical instruments preserved at the National Museum of Athens. Only one of these pair is exhibited actually in the museum, but I could access the archive, and you see here that, if you read more than read, you can hear here the Vytautas Gortinias. And so the excavations made in 1891. And the only other instrument found in excavations in Arcadia, so far I know for the moment, is the tortoise shell used for a lyre found in the sanctuary of Apollo Epicurus at Basail, which is the ancient city of Figali. But we know that this was offered to the god Apollo. It looks like the two tortoise shells I showed you 2 years ago in Cremona found in Argos, but we have no idea of who was the dedicator. In addition to this offering, we have to consider the textual sources about offering more general, and especially I would show you this text of Pausanias, so which is actually a text from the book, the 10th book, which is related to Delphi, but reminding the history of the Delphic contest. That's what Pausanias writes. The winner, so for the first session in 586 BC, the winners proclaimed were Melambus, a Stephalenian for Kypharoida, and Ekembrotos, an Arcadian, for singing to the Aulos, with Takadas of Aulos for Aulos playing. What I say is confirmed by the votive offering of Ekembrotos, a bronze tripod dedicated to Heracles at Thebes. The tripod has its inscription. Ekembrotos of Arcadia dedicated this pleasant gift to Heracles when he won a victory at the competitions of the Amphictyons, singing for the Greeks tunes and lamentation. Because he was the only one to win at the Aulodic contest, because afterwards the Amphictyons decided to get rid of Aulodi because it was too lamentative. So the offering is not an instrument, but a tripod, which Ekembrotos dedicated to Heracles in Thebes, so not in Delphi, or neither in Arcadia. The origin of the tripod is not mentioned, but it is probably the object he had as a prize in the competition in Delphi, because at that time, 519, 586 BC, the competition was not Stephanite, so there was no crown, but it was crematite, so when you won, you had an object. We don't know which object, but these tripods probably come from the booty taken on the Phocidians, because the competition happened just after the First Phocidian War, between the upcoming Amphictyony and the local people in Delphi. That's one thing, so that's not an instrument. Secondly, why is this tripod dedicated to Heracles and not to Apollo? And thirdly, why in Thebes and not in Delphi? And what is the role of memory in this text? Because as you can see, Pausanias is writing about Delphi, but mentioning someone who won in Delphi, but he's reminding an inscription he should have seen in Thebes. And actually, when you look, but I won't discuss it too deeply now, when you look at the metric of the inscription, it doesn't work. It's not regular. So the question is whether it's like that, or if Pausanias is using his memory to recall this inscription that makes some errors, I would say, except maybe the second verse, which looks like an hexameter, more or less. But that's another topic. Anyhow, Ekembrotos is also said to come from Arcadia, not from one specific city. Is it because Pausanias doesn't remember the city, or at that time was already a kind of confederation? We have no evidence for any confederation in the 6th century in Arcadia, or just to mention the leading role of Arcadia in music in the 6th century. So why, again, this tripod was dedicated in Thebes? In Thebes, you have the sanctuary of Heracles close to the one of Apollo Ismenios, And as you may know, there is an important myth related to Delphi that Heracles tried to take the tripod from Apollo, and this was on the decoration of the Siphnian treasury in Delphi. So it was a famous myth. So it looks like Ekembrotos, a kind of, not a joke, but choosing Heracles Temenos rather than Apollon Temenos, maybe because after him the competition of Arcady was abandoned. So that's an hypothesis. In this Hall of Fame of the most famous Arcadian musicians, we should also add Agelaos of Tegea, who was the first winner of the Thetaristic contest in Delphi in 558, some decades later. So you have a strong, as I told you, Arcadian musical school, and Peloponnesian more general. And to these people, we can also add Clonas, who was famous also in Olody, reputed as the composer of holydic gnomes, who lived just after Terpander, so he's semi-legendary. But what is interesting, according to Plutarch, interrogation quote, in the De Musica, the Arcadians say that he's coming from Tegea, and of course the Boeotians say that he's coming from Thebes. So memory is something you can play when it is question of ethnic identity and a kind of protection of and rewriting history of one's ethnos. We should add also the figure of Anute, which is one of the very few big female composers we know, who is also from Tegea. And finally, about the role of memory, the third modality is to transmit repertoires. And this is a very famous text of Polybius in his histories regarding all the musical habits of Arcadian people. For it is a fact known and admitted by all that it is almost only among the Arcadians that children, as soon as they are able to speak, are accustomed to singing, in accordance with the laws, the hymns and paeans by which each, in accordance with ancestral customs, catata patria, celebrates local heroes and gods. Then learning the names of Philoxenus and Timotheus, with great ardor they dance each year in the theatres, accompanied by the Dionysian Aulos players, the children in the children's competitions and the young people in the competitions which are said to be men. In the same way, throughout their lives, they make musical cadences at their banquets, using not so much foreign singers as themselves, ordering each other to sing in turn. The question is, and arises the new music, the so-called new music, why Philoxenus and Timotheus? I just want to give some idea, and we'll go back in the end to that. Philoxenus is not very well known, apart from his two works, the Cyclope, which is actually exactly a piece related to Arcadia, because this is not the Homeric Cyclope, but the Cyclope who is in love with Galatea. And the other is the Mysians. And the Mysians is the people who are supposed to come from an ancestor who is Telephos, son of Heracles, and of Auge, who was the daughter of the king of Tegea. Everything clear? Okay, I didn't lose you. Okay. So the works of Philoxenus may be explained like that. That is, they are Arcadian myth Philoxenus dealt with. And yeah, time is going on. So just so the habit of giving some excerpts from ancient music, we have it also in Delphi from two brothers coming from Arcadia, from Phaneos, And this inscription, so displayed in Delphi, says that both brothers performed pieces of ancient poets, Arcadian poetan, appropriate to the god and our city. So it is quite sure that the pieces which are performed are related to the history, to the local history, either the local history of the performer or the local history of the place where the pieces are performed. So that's very well known that Arcadian musicians played among these ancient poets Timotheus. That's also a famous text from Plutarch, and also the anecdote is also quoted by Pausanias about the Kitharoidos Pylades, who was singing the first verse of Timotheus' Nomos Persai when Philopoemen, the strateg of the general, entered the theater of Argos at the time when Greece tried to get its liberty thanks to Titus Flaminius. Quite so, just to recall you, that's the theater of Argos. That was last year in ArcHiMèdE. And on this also inscription of an actor from Tegea, so it was found in Tegea, but we don't know anything about this actor. Actually, if you look at the pieces which were performed in each contest, you see everywhere the name of Euripides and some others. I go very quickly in my two last points, because I already gave you all the sources actually. Question of music and politics. As I told you, the problem with Arcadian people is that sometimes they are presented as coming from their own city, Tegea, or sometimes from Arcadia in general. The first confederation we know was created in 371 after the Battle of Leuctra, which is the victory of the Theban coalition against Athens and Sparta. So Arcadia decided to create a confederation because they were anxious about the following events. And they decided to coin this, to strike this coin with the syrinx, as you can see, and the monogram Arch for Arcadia. But 10 years later, at the Battle of Mantinea in 362, the coalition was abandoned because Mantinea decided to support Athens and Tegea decided to support Thebes. But links between Athens and Tegea remained. I show you this choretic inscriptions from of the 4th century BC, where you see that there is one aulos player, Callistratos from Tegea, who was playing the aulos. In the 3rd century, that's the same context, choretic inscription for the Targelia in Athens. This time we have Lysippos of Arcadia, another city. So it seems that depending on the political situation of the city, sometimes you give the city, sometimes you give the confederation. Interestingly, this Lysippos, who was Korodidaskalos, is also known in a Delphic inscription, that is the last one, as an instructor for aulos player in the Soteria of Delphi. And if you look at all of the list we have about the Soteria in Delphi, which is a competition which was created after the Gaul invasion of 279, you see that 20% of the artists are coming from Arcadia, but you still find some people who are said to come from Tegea or Clayton, for example. To my final point, why did they use the new music in this period? Why in the beginning, early 2nd century BC, we have so many elements about the new music? First, I will come back to Polybius' text because I never see this explanation of this expression tois Dionysia kois solidaes as referring to the technicae. For me, it's quite obvious because we are in a context where Polybius is dealing with theater. He's talking about Aulos player Dionysiac, but most of the scholars have thought it was related to banquets, but Aulos players from banquets in such a context make no sense for me because it's the agonistic context. So I think that's the expression Polybius used to define Dionysiac technitai. And I would like to highlight the role of the Dionysian technitai in this spreading of the new music. So maybe these Aulos players were members of these big corporations, and we can compare the text of Polybius with this inscription found in Theos, related to a Cretan embassy, which was made of one guitar player who also played works of Timotheus, Polyeidos of Celeria, and ancient poets. And Polyeidos is especially known for dithyrambs, and we know at that time that in Theos the dithyramb was particularly in favor. And in Theos there was one big corporation of technitai, which was the technitai of Ionia and Hellespont. And Theos was the capital of this corporation. And if you look at Arcadia, because we know that the soteria were organized by the technitai of Isthmus and Nemea, see that Arcadian artists belong to another corporation, which was the technitai of Isthmus and Nemea, but both are using the same repertoire. So my question actually would be, to the end, would be, is there any link between, through the repertoires, between the technitai of Arcadia and the technitai of Asia Minor? And actually we have two links. The first is Heracles. Heracles, as I told you, is the father of Telephos. And Telephos is the main hero of Pergamon, which was the branch of the corporation of the technitai of Ionia and Hellespont. So there is a link, and my opinion that the Attalid kingdom, who wants to have a Greekness in this ancestor, so chose Arcadia, one hero coming from Arcadia, and that could lead to a link between both of them. But if you want to know more about that, I give you a rendezvous in 10 days in Rome, where I will expose the whole dossier, but I'm sure that not all of you can come to Rome, so actually there is one person who is the missing link between all of that is Craton, who was an Aulos player from the corporation of Ionia and Hellespont, who was the founder of the branch of Pergamon and who was honored by the technitai of Isthmus and Nemea, whose members were mainly from Arcadia. And that's all for me today.
I told you that it was very good. Every topic of ancient Greek music studies, so he combined here all his knowledge on history, on epigraphy, on many kind of things, and I think we could have a whole picture of this specific argument. Any question? Yes.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. In your studies of Arcadian music, do you see a greater emphasis on Kithra playing or Aulos playing? And if so, from the inscriptions, and if so, what do you have to say about that?
aulos is the most important, and singing. Aulos and singing. Now, Kythera is not that important. In the source we have. In the sources we have. But yes, in the 6th century, Arcadia is clearly relating to aulos and singing, that is aulodi actually, singing to the aulos. And in the Hellenistic evidence, most of them are singers or aulos players. Although the first winner of Kythera in Delphi, Kytherist, is an Arcadian.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that it won't be in Italy in 10 days' time. And because of that, being very excited about this last PowerPoint, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about this this lyre inscription that you have in this
The lyre?
Yes,
Sorry.
please.
Actually, we have two inscriptions in Delphi related to two brothers who came to Delphi to perform ancient poets. The first one I told you about is from Phineas, but we have a more ancient one, so 30 years, 40 years earlier. This, again, these are two brothers, but coming from Aegaea, that is the north of the Peloponnesus, so that's Achaia, that's not Arcadia. But they also gave some excerpts from the ancient poets, as you can see here. And actually, the inscription was engraved on this basis with this lyre at the very beginning of the inscription, and in the inscription actually you can read diaton lulicon systematon, so there is a link to the lyre which is depicted, and this monument actually is the basis of the statue dedicated to the strategos Philopoimen I talk about. And we are here in Delphi in a place actually which was the Arcadian place, because in Delphi you have places which are Laconian, Lacedaemonian, some places are Athenian, the Athenian treasury and the Athenian stoa, but here that's a monument, this big monument was an Arcadian monument. So they decided to put the statue of Philopoimen, the Arcadian general, in front of it, and on this statue on Philopoimen they added this inscription and another one for an actor also from Megalopolis, because Philopoimen was born in Megalopolis. So that's...
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can read my question exactly where I meant to. I meant the exact drawing of the lyre. How often are you seeing actual depictions of lyres like this in this particular area? And are there any relations? Do you ever see any reference to the myth of Heracles perhaps breaking the lyre or anything like this that we're working on this head, or any of those types of myths popping up?
You mean in Delphi?
Or just in the
because in the Athenian ceramics, yes, but not. Well, we don't have so many graffiti like that in the Greek world. And actually, in Delphi, we have three representations of musical instruments. But well, it has. It's rather related to Apollo, actually, not really Heracles.
I was just very surprised by this beautiful depiction of it being so clear and perfect, and I was wondering if there's...
Yeah, that's it. Very nice. This is 8 strings, and here an attempt to figure the shell with these round circles. So it's from behind, the lyre from behind.
Thank you very much. Good.
We have time for one small question, if there is any.
Thank you, Sylvain, for this very, very contextualized, well-contextualized paper. And I wonder about why do you think, it's just to know your hypothesis, why do you think that only Pausanias speak about music of Arcadians? Pausanias and Polybius, but not so many.
Do you know many Arcadian writers?
No, yeah. Yeah, of course. No, but I was...
Polybius is the
Yeah.
Arcadian writer.
Yes, of course. But Pausanias.
But Pausanias, well, first he's been to Arcadia, that's one thing. And the second thing, of course, he's also compiling lots of sources. And he's talking about Arcadia because of the competitions in Delphi. So it's not exactly Arcadia. It's I'm talking about the competitions in Delphi, and by chance, Arcadians were winners of this competition.
But I wonder if it was because of the link between these competitors and Pergamon. The link you put? You spoke also about the context of Pergamon.
But Pergamon is only 2nd century BC.
And one of the hypotheses of Pausanias' birthplace or the context where he lived and so focuses on Pergamon. So, so for this reason, I was asking.
Now I see your point.
Yeah,
okay. No, I hadn't thought about it actually, I have to say.
I don't know.
But thanks. Thanks for
Thank you.
the suggestion.